All right, Genesis chapter 13 is where our lesson is going to be from. And what I want us to do in this lesson, I feel weird about this lesson because usually what I'll do is I'll go through a passage and then I'll have supporting points and then I'll have illustrations and put all that together. And this lesson is going to be a little different because it's more or less a narrative. There's not going to be a lot that I add, but maybe we'll look at it from a different point, because what I want us to think about today is decisions determine destiny. The decisions you make today either make it easier for you to follow God, or they make it more difficult for you to follow God. And there's a lot of us who are making a lot of decisions. Where am I going to go to college? Some of the young people ask. Well, you go to college because you want a degree. You go to college because of the college life. You go to college because that's perhaps where your parents went or whatever else it may be. But is where you choose to go to college a place that will help you spiritually, or is it a place that will make it more difficult for you to be spiritual? Who will you marry? Will you marry a Christian, or will you marry somebody who does not yet have a relationship with the Lord? You're not going to be judged one way or the other eternally by the person you marry. But the person that you're attracted to and the person that you spend your life with, the person that you become one flesh with, will either make it more easy to be a Christian, or they will make it more difficult for you to be a Christian. As you raise your kids and you put them in this sport or that sport, this activity or that activity, and as our lives all fill with so many different things, is the way that you're raising your children making it easier for them as they grow up to be a Christian? Or is it making it more difficult for you to be a Christian? What congregation you attend, what you do for entertainment, where you go, where you live, each one of these decisions, if you look at them either individually or as a whole with all your other decisions, make it either easier for you to be a Christian, or they make it more difficult for you to be a Christian. Now, taking each one of these individually, these decisions that I bring up, and these are big decisions, there's also many smaller decisions we make. We can make a bad decision and still be okay. You can still overcome obstacles and be faithful. But why? Why would you make that kind of decision? And that concept, which I just brought up, that concept which I just talked about, is seen clearly when you start here in chapter 13 and you go to about chapter 18 or 19. You start seeing where God, through his providence, is working with Lot, working with Abraham, and he's showing us decisions determine destiny. Well, let's look at Lot first. Of course, you look in Genesis 12, Abraham is called from Ur. And as he's called from the northern part of the Fertile Crescent, he's called down to a pretty dry part of the Fertile Crescent, and he determines he's going to follow God. And he brings his nephew, who is Lot, with him. And so they travel down, and God begins to bless them immensely. And it gets to the point where there are so many goats and so many sheep and so many donkeys. Everything they have is just increasing so much that it begins to destroy the land where they're at. They just have too much livestock. And so they realize they can't stay together, otherwise everything they have is going to start to die because there's just too much of it. And so Abraham says, we've got to separate. And so Abraham says, Lot, you choose which way you go, and I'll go the other way. You choose what it is you want in life. You choose your direction, and this is your opportunity. Well, as you read in this passage, what you'll notice is Lot begins to look around. And he looks and he sees over in this direction, it looks like the Garden of Eden. And if you're a goat herder, that's good stuff. He sees over in this area, there's a good population of pretty wealthy people. And he knows if you're around wealthy people, a lot of times it's easier to get wealthy. He sees that this place looks a lot like where he's from as far as the fertility of that crescent there. And so this reminds him of home. But what never comes up is that he sees that God is not located over there. The people over here are pretty evil. But that's not his focus. And so he makes the decision and he tells Abram, I'm going this way to where the grass is greener. He makes this decision because of economics. He makes this decision because of popularity. He makes this decision because it's going to make his life easier. But he never places God anywhere in that conversation. And so he goes off in this direction, and he goes off doing these things. And as he goes off into that way, we see where God plants a warning and says, be careful, Lot, about what you've chosen. In chapter 14, a bunch of kings get together, and that's what they did back then. About 6 kings on this side, about 8 kings on this side. They have a war, and they get after it. And because Lot's now living in a city, Lot somehow gets caught up in it. And there he is in Sodom, and somebody conquers Sodom, and he is captured, and his wife is captured. His children are captured. Everything he owns is taken off as spoils of war. Well, Abraham's not part of a city, and so Abraham's not involved in the war, but he hears what happens. He gathers up his men, trains them as an army, and he goes and he rescues Lot from that captivity. It should have been a warning to Lot, you be careful what you choose, because when you put yourself around the wrong people, sometimes decisions are made for you. 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil companionship corrupts good morals. But Lot receives his freedom. Abraham rejects the king of Sodom, looks to King Melchizedek, and he offers a sacrifice looking forward to the day of Jesus. Lot doesn't spend a lot of time in worship. He just goes right back to the city where he was. He didn't learn about his lesson. Now, over time, as you read here in chapter 13, you see where Lot begins to move more and more closely, and he finds himself at the gate of the city of Sodom. You find himself inside of the city of Sodom. He finds himself engaged in the city of Sodom. And so that brings us to chapter 19. And in chapter 19, verse 1, we see that not only has Lot moved towards Sodom, not only has Lot moved into Sodom, now Lot is sitting at the gate, which means he is one of the leaders. We might think of him as the mayor of the city of Sodom. Now imagine how weird that would be for a person of God to be the mayor of the city which we still talk about today as the centerpiece of immorality. But here's Lot. He's found himself in this situation. He's found himself in this time, and now he's in trouble. But you know, the Bible tells us a little bit about him. 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning of verse 7, says, Lot was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man, even though he dwelt among them, was tormented in his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Now, envision with me what's going on here. Here's Lot. He has found himself in the city, and he's watching what all the citizens of the city are doing. And in his heart, he realizes, that's not me. That's not what I need to be around. That is something which disturbs me, which I hate to see with my eyes. But what does Lot do? There's money to be made in this city. There's people that are important to know in this city. Life is pretty easy in this city. And so even though it hurts himself morally, and he realizes this is not where God would want me to be, he stays there at the gate. You open up Psalm 1. And it talks about, blessed is the man who walks not with the ungodly, who stands not at the gate, and who does not sit with the wicked. You think David was thinking about Lot when he wrote Psalm 1? It sure looks like he was. Now, looking at us today, how many of us have found ourselves to be comfortable walking around with people who really go against the teachings of Christ? How many of us have placed ourselves to the point to where we tend to stand among them and be counted among them? And even though we know it's wrong, even though we know it's not what God wants us to do, there we find ourselves. How many of us have moved ourselves to be the mayor of Sin Town? And while we're different, or at least we know we are in our heart, we see all around these terrible things which are happening. Now, if we stop the story right here, you see a man who is apparently still faithful to God. He's made decisions which make it more difficult to be faithful. He's living in a place where you would not expect him to be, but he still appears to be a righteous man. 2 Peter says his soul is vexed. He feels bad about it. He knows it's not the best, but he still stays there. But now chapter 19 is going to continue. 3 men, they seem to be angels, come to see Abraham. And as they're there, they begin to negotiate about Sodom and Gomorrah. What if there's 50 righteous people? Abraham would ask. What if there's 40? What if there's just 10? God says he's a person of grace. And if there's 10, he'll spare that entire city. But probably Abraham and God know what the consequences are going to be of the decisions that have been made. And so we begin reading about these angels, these men who come to the city of Sodom. Lot is the man at the gate who's the head. And these men walk in and they decide they're going to spend the night on the city square, and Lot realizes that's a bad idea. And knowing these are men of God, he goes to them and he says, you're not allowed to stay here in the city square. You don't realize what's going to happen. Now, he doesn't tell them what's going to happen, but he says, you can't stay here. You got to go to my house. Lot knows the situation, and he knows what very likely could happen. And so while he's not telling him, hey, you got to get out of here because what's going to happen, he just says, hey, you need to come to my house. And so he insists, and they come to his house. Now that night, Sodom is going to become Sodom. And the men of the city come to Lot's house, and they say, you have somebody there, bring them out. We're going to do detestable things to them. What do you do if you're Lot? What do you do? If Jesus or an angel was at your house, would you allow somebody to hurt them? You better not. And so Lot makes an unconscionable decision, a terrible decision. You have 2 daughters, you have God. Which one do you give up? It's a crazy thought. But Lot's put himself in a situation where he's having to make terrible, terrible, terrible decisions. And so he says, here's my daughters. Imagine being placed in a situation where that's the best decision you can make. The angels bring everybody in, they blind all the men, and they say to Lot, we've got to leave. Lot is so ensconced, so situated in this city, he won't go. The angels show grace to Abraham, grab Lot, grab his family, and yank him and drag him out of town, telling him what's going to happen. Lot goes to his sons-in-laws and tells them, you need to get out of here. As a matter of fact, you bring those sons-in-laws and their wives and his daughters and his wife, and you start getting really close to 10. But the sons-in-laws have grown up in Sodom. They become Sodom, and they laugh at Lot and his righteous teaching. He loses those sons-in-laws and perhaps his other daughters. As Lot begins to leave town, he goes to the city of Zoar, gets scared there, and goes beyond, and suddenly the whole world, it seems, begins to blow up. And his wife, whom he has raised in Sodom, who he has allowed to grow in love with Sodom, looks back and longs for what she's lost, and she's destroyed. They go up to the mountains of Zoar and live in a cave, and as they're living in that cave, they are confused because they think they're the only living people left, and his daughters do unconscionable things, once again with Lot. And from there, the Ammonites and the Moabites are started. Now, how can a godly man participate in incest? How can a godly man lose his wife? How can a godly man insist on staying in a place that will soon be destroyed? How can a godly man lose his daughters? How can he make so many terrible decisions? It all started in Genesis 13. One bad decision leads to the next bad decision, leads to the next bad decision. And it gets to the point where we start having to make decisions that are terrible things. There's no right answer. That happens to many people today. Why do drug addicts do so many crimes? They found themselves in a situation where there's no good answer. Why do many good, godly people leave the church? They've made so many bad decisions, there does not seem to be a good answer. Why oftentimes do we find it so difficult to be righteous? It's because some of these previous decisions we've made have made it more and more and more difficult to be right with God. And so you start in chapter 13 and you see a very righteous man who has left his home just like Abram did, who has been just as faithful, just like Abram did. And then he starts making decisions, thinking about economics, thinking about ease of life, thinking about popularity, which lead him away from God, and it just cascades down. Don't be Lot. When you make right decisions at the beginning, it's so much easier to make right decisions in the middle and the end. When you make poor decisions in the beginning, you can always repent, and you can always come back, but it's more and more and more difficult. The difficulty level is increased. Now, juxtaposed, let's look at Abraham. Abram was called by God, Genesis 12, and he was faithful. As a matter of fact, just to summarize Abram's life, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. If you've got your Bibles with you, let's just go to Hebrews 11. That way we're not skipping around the book of Genesis. Hebrews chapter 11, let's start in verse 8. When Abram makes proper decisions, his life becomes blessed, his rewards continue to increase. And the more he does for God, the more God blesses him. Okay? Look at verse 8. By faith, he followed God, even though he didn't know where he's going. Look at verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place where he would receive an inheritance. And he went to a place he had no idea. He did not know where he was going. He made the decision, I may not understand what I'm doing. It looks like I'm leaving behind a fortune. It looks like I'm leaving behind my family. But I trust in God, and so I will follow him wherever he leads. Now look at verse 9. By faith, he lived without a household. He lived without his extended family. Verse 9, by faith, he dwelt in the land of promises in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob and heirs with him of the same promise, because he waited for that city without foundations, whose builder and maker is God. You see, he went out to live in a tent because he realized God's building him a mansion. Lot had looked over at Sodom and he saw that city. Abraham looked over to heaven and he realized what God was truly building. Now, that's not to say that Abram was perfect. He sure wasn't, was he? Twice he sold his wife. My goodness. One time to Pharaoh, one time to the Philistine king. Both times God cursed those people and brought his wife right back. One time Abram did not trust God, and so therefore you have Ishmael. When Abram realized the bad decisions he had made, he repented and he came back. And so, yes, Abram made poor decisions, but every time he made that poor decision, he repented and he turned back to be what God would have him to do. Now, let's stay in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11:11. By faith, Sarah, that is Abraham's wife, received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a son when she was past age, because she judged him faithful, that who had promised. And from one man, him as good as dead, were born many as the stars in the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand by the seashore. Abram remained faithful even when it didn't make sense. Now, I got in trouble early in my preaching career. I thought it was a great illustration. It was not. What I did was I was trying to illustrate how crazy this situation was with Abram. And so I said, imagine brother so-and-so, he is 75 years old having a child. And then I said, but brother so-and-so is 98. And imagine him fathering a child. And I learned quickly after the sermon, don't do that. But here's Abram, promised by God, you're going to have a child. And he waits 25 years. He gets to the point where people are supposed to have great-grandchildren, and he's still waiting on a boy. But even when it didn't make sense, even when it was different than what the rest of the world did, Abram made the right decision, and God blessed him. And God worked things out. Now skip down, if you're in Hebrews 11, all the way down to verse 17. Hebrews 11, beginning of verse 17. By faith, Abram, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, which he also raised him up even in a figurative sense. You wait 25 years for a kid. That kid's finally born, and God says, that's awesome, let's go kill him. It doesn't make sense. To the world, it wouldn't have made sense, I don't think, to Sarah, and it didn't make sense to Abram for this to happen. Now, for those who like to study things more deeply, I'm not going to go down this road because we don't have time, and it doesn't really go with the subject. But study how Sarah treats Abraham very differently after the sacrifice than she did before. Sarah did not appreciate it, but Abraham was faithful to God, and Abraham did it. What decisions are you making that bring you closer to God? I hope today you're Abraham. And when it doesn't make sense to the world, I hope you stay faithful in every decision you make. When it doesn't even make sense to you, I hope you're faithful to God in every decision that you make. When you're called to a place and you don't know where you're going and you don't know what the end's going to look like, I hope that you're faithful to God. You pull yourself back to Genesis 13, and I'm not sure you can say that Abraham loved God more than Lot did. They both had left Ur, they're both faithful, but at this point, Lot began making decisions without God in mind. And as he made those decisions, each one put him into a more difficult level. Now, we're shocked by decisions 7 and 8 and 9 about how far Lot had gone and the stupid things he's doing at the end. But what brought him there were the earlier decisions of where he was going to live, what he was going to do, and how he was going to do this. Those things led him to that difficult spot. The point of the sermon today, don't find yourself in Sodom where you're having to make those kind of decisions. Put yourself in the tent of Abraham where your decisions make it easier for you to follow God. Decisions determine destiny. It sounds so simple, and it sounds so easy that God blesses those who are faithful, but bad decisions have consequences. But how do you apply that to life? When you're thinking about education, find a place that draws you closer to God and will make it easier for you to be faithful. When you're looking for a spouse, find someone who will bring you closer to God and who will make it easier for you to raise your children in the Lord. When you're looking for a career, find a job that will bring you closer to God and will make it easier for you to participate in church. Whatever decision it is that you're making, Don't just look at the green plains. Don't just look at the big city. Don't think about the ease of life. Think about your relationship with God. Because as you build your house on the Lord's word, it will stand firm no matter what the world brings against it. But when you turn from the Lord, you can still be saved, you can still be faithful, but those decisions may be difficult.